Hello, little eager to learn flowers. Have you ever felt that leaving the house no longer feels exciting, but instead just drains your energy? When I was younger, I loved going here and there, visiting friends, family, even stopping by the neighbor's house for a quick chat. But now, let's just say my couch and I have developed a deep and meaningful relationship. It's not that I don't love people. I truly cherish my relationships. But over time, I realized that not every visit brings joy. Some leave me smiling, while others leave me completely exhausted, wondering, is this still worth it? Today, I want to share 7 stories, moments that made me realize that saying no, thanks, I'll stay home, isn't about isolation. It's about choosing peace. And story number 2 and number 6 might just surprise you, because sometimes the smallest things change the way we see everything. So, grab a cup of tea, find a comfortable seat, and let's go on this little journey together. Who knows? By the end, you might just see why I prefer my slippers over my visiting shoes. Number 1. The endless staircase struggle. Mr. Richard, a 72-year-old man, had always enjoyed visiting friends. He valued deep conversations, the warmth of familiar company, and the small joy of catching up over coffee. But one particular visit changed everything. His old friend George had just moved into a beautiful 3-story house. From the outside, it was stunning, elegant, spacious, and filled with charm. When George invited Richard over to see it, he happily agreed, not realizing what awaited him inside. The moment he stepped in, he was met with a long, winding staircase. George, filled with excitement, clapped him on the back and said, "Come on, let me show you around." Richard, not wanting to seem rude, smiled and followed. The first few steps were manageable, but as they climbed higher, something changed. His breathing grew heavier, his legs felt stiff, and suddenly, the simple act of walking up the stairs felt like a mountain climb. He didn't want to show his discomfort, so he forced himself to keep up, even as his heart pounded in his chest. By the time they reached the 2nd floor, Richard felt like he had just finished a marathon. He discreetly placed a hand on the railing, pretending to admire the view while secretly catching his breath. But George, he was already halfway up to the 3rd floor, chatting away, completely unaware of Richard's silent struggle. As Richard finally made it to the top, he collapsed onto the nearest chair, barely hearing George's enthusiastic words about the view. Instead, he was focused on the realization that his body wasn't what it used to be. The stairs had defeated him, and it was a humbling, sobering moment. That night, as he got home and eased into his favorite chair, he made a quiet decision. No more multi-story house visits. It wasn't worth the struggle, the embarrassment, or the exhaustion that followed. Aging comes with changes, some small, some undeniable. Climbing stairs that once seemed effortless now felt like an uphill battle. And that's okay. From that day forward, when friends invited him over, he asked a simple question: "Do you have stairs?" If the answer was yes, he politely declined, not out of laziness, but because he had learned to respect his body's limits. Key lesson: as we age, our bodies change, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. There is no reason to push beyond our limits just to please others. If something feels exhausting, uncomfortable, or even unsafe, it's okay to say no. Prioritizing your comfort and well-being isn't giving up. It's adapting to life in a way that allows you to truly enjoy it. Number 2. The tea that wasn't tea. Mrs. Margaret, a 74-year-old woman, had always loved the ritual of tea time. A warm cup, a quiet afternoon, and good conversation. What could be better? She had spent years enjoying these simple pleasures with friends, savoring the comfort of familiar flavors like Earl Grey or chamomile. But one visit changed the way she felt about tea forever. One crisp autumn afternoon, Margaret decided to visit her old neighbor, Betty, who had recently invited her over for a special tea. Betty was known for being a kind but slightly eccentric hostess, always experimenting with new things. Margaret, expecting a cozy chat and a familiar cup of tea, happily accepted the invitation. As soon as she arrived, Betty ushered her into the living room with a bright smile. Sit down, sit down. I've made something wonderful for us," she beamed, disappearing into the kitchen. Margaret settled into the couch, looking forward to the soothing warmth of a perfectly brewed cup. A few moments later, Betty returned with 2 steaming mugs. Margaret picked up hers, inhaling deeply, only to immediately realize something was off. Instead of the gentle, fragrant aroma of tea, there was a strange, almost medicinal sweetness in the air. Still, not wanting to be rude, Margaret took a sip. Her taste buds instantly revolted. The liquid was thick, overly sweet, and had an odd bitterness that lingered long after she swallowed. She barely stopped herself from grimacing. "Betty, dear," she said carefully, forcing a polite smile. "This is different. What kind of tea is this?" Betty clapped her hands together excitedly. "Oh, it's prune juice. I thought you'd love it." Margaret nearly choked. "Prune juice." She set the mug down quickly, trying to compose herself. She wanted to be gracious, but in that moment, all she could think about was how desperately she wanted her familiar cup of tea instead of this strange, syrupy concoction. As she sat there, nodding along to Betty's cheerful conversation, she realized something. This was not the relaxing, comforting visit she had envisioned. Instead of enjoying her favorite ritual, she was trapped in a battle of politeness versus her taste buds. That night, as she returned home, she let out a sigh of relief. She walked straight to her kitchen, brewed herself the perfect cup of Earl Grey, and took a slow, satisfying sip. It was heaven, and that was the moment she made a quiet decision. From now on, tea time would happen on her own terms. Key lesson: visiting others can mean stepping into unexpected, sometimes uncomfortable situations. While it's nice to be polite, we shouldn't feel obligated to endure things that don't bring us joy. Sometimes the best company is our own, with a cup of tea brewed exactly the way we like it. Number 3. No more patience for meaningless gossip. Mrs. Eleanor, a 76-year-old woman, used to love the excitement of a good conversation. There was a time when sitting down with friends, sharing stories, and catching up on the latest news felt like a lively, enjoyable way to connect. But something changed over the years. One afternoon, Eleanor decided to visit an old acquaintance, Linda, whom she hadn't seen in a while. She thought it would be a chance to reminisce, to talk about life, family, and maybe even share some laughs over old memories. But the moment she sat down in Linda's living room, she sensed something was off. The conversation quickly took a turn. Instead of catching up on meaningful moments, Linda dove straight into gossip. Who gained weight? Who was having problems in their marriage? Who wasn't speaking to whom? At first, Eleanor nodded along, pretending to be interested, but she could feel her energy draining with every word. It wasn't light-hearted talk. It was judgment, negativity, and constant criticism of others. Every sentence seemed to focus on someone's mistakes, their flaws, their misfortunes. As Eleanor sat there, staring into her untouched cup of coffee, a deep realization hit her. This was not the kind of conversation she wanted to have anymore. She thought about how precious time had become. At this stage in life, every day was a gift, and she didn't want to waste another second engaging in negativity. She wanted to spend her time talking about things that mattered, about joy, about books, about memories that made her smile, about the things that still made life beautiful. So, she did something she had never done before. She cut the visit short. She stood up, politely excused herself, and walked out into the fresh air. As she breathed deeply, she felt lighter, as if she had left behind a weight she didn't even realize she had been carrying. That day, she made a quiet but powerful decision. She was done with meaningless, draining conversations. If a visit wasn't uplifting, nourishing, or at least enjoyable, she simply wouldn't stay. She had earned the right to be selective with her time and energy. Key lesson: as we grow older, our time and energy become more valuable than ever. There's no reason to spend them on negativity, on gossip, or on conversations that leave us feeling worse than when we arrived. If a conversation doesn't enrich your life, it's okay to walk away. Choose peace, choose meaningful moments, and most importantly, choose yourself. Number 4. Every visit feels like a trap. Mr. Henry, a 74-year-old man, had always been someone who valued friendships. He enjoyed catching up with old friends, reminiscing about the past, and sharing stories over a cup of coffee. But as he got older, he realized something frustrating. Some visits were never just a quick catch-up anymore. They felt like a trap. It all started with a seemingly harmless afternoon visit to his old friend, Frank. They had planned for a short coffee break, maybe an hour or so, just enough time to chat, and then head home for some quiet relaxation. But from the moment Henry walked through the door, he felt the invisible ropes tightening around him. Frank was overjoyed to see him, too overjoyed. "Oh, you can't leave just yet. Stay for lunch." Henry, being polite, agreed. After all, what was an extra hour? Then, after lunch came dessert. "Let's sit outside for a bit," Frank suggested. The sun was already dipping in the sky, and Henry was feeling restless. He had other plans, maybe a nap, maybe reading his book, but he didn't know how to excuse himself without seeming rude. Then came the worst part, the moment Frank said, "Well, it's getting late now. Why don't you just stay the night?" Henry froze. He didn't plan on sleeping over. He didn't bring anything with him. But how could he refuse without sounding ungrateful? And so, one small yes led to another, and before he knew it, he was trapped in a visit that lasted an entire weekend. By the time he finally left, he wasn't just exhausted, he was frustrated with himself. That visit taught him a valuable lesson. If you don't set boundaries, some people won't set them for you. From that day on, Henry changed the way he approached visits. He made sure to set clear expectations from the start. "I'd love to come by, but I can only stay for an hour." If someone tried to push him to stay longer, he smiled and firmly said, "I have things to do." And most importantly, he learned that saying no doesn't make you a bad friend. It makes you a person who values their own time. Key lesson: some visits shouldn't turn into an overnight stay or an all-day event. If you find yourself dreading the idea of being stuck in a never-ending visit, it's time to set clear limits. Your time is just as important as anyone else's, and it's okay to leave when you're ready. Being polite should never come at the cost of your own comfort. Number 5. Feeling lost in modern conversations. Mrs. Helen, a 75-year-old woman, had always considered herself a good conversationalist. She loved deep discussions, meaningful exchanges, and even the occasional chat about everyday life. But over time, she started feeling like an outsider in the very conversations she once enjoyed. One afternoon, she visited her grandniece, Olivia, a bright and energetic woman in her late 20s. Helen had always looked forward to their talks, remembering how they used to bond over books, music, and family stories. But this time, something was different. The moment Helen sat down, Olivia launched into an excited discussion about viral TikTok trends, influencers, and the latest smartphone features. Helen nodded along at first, hoping she would catch on. But the more Olivia spoke, the more she felt completely out of place. The words felt like another language, hashtags, algorithms, AI-generated content. Helen could barely keep up. Then came the moment that truly stung. "Oh, Aunt Helen, you probably wouldn't get it. It's kind of a Gen Z thing," Olivia said with a laugh. Helen smiled politely, but inside something cracked. When had she become someone people assumed wouldn't get it? She wasn't clueless. She had spent a lifetime learning, adapting, staying engaged. But at that moment, she felt invisible. She tried to shift the conversation, asking about books, history, or family traditions, but Olivia quickly lost interest. It became clear that the things Helen valued no longer had a place in these modern conversations. That day, she left with a bittersweet realization. There were some conversations she just wasn't meant to be part of anymore. She wasn't angry at Olivia. She understood that each generation speaks its own language. But it also made her question, where do I fit in now? In the weeks that followed, Helen stopped trying so hard to keep up. Instead, she sought out conversations that made her feel seen, valued, and understood. She spent more time with people who shared her interests, who enjoyed talking about things that mattered to her. And she learned that it was okay to step away from conversations that left her feeling small. Key lesson: aging doesn't mean we have to force ourselves to keep up with trends that don't interest us. If a conversation makes you feel lost or invisible, it's okay to step away and seek out people who value your voice, your stories, and your wisdom. Some conversations are just noise, but the right ones can still bring warmth, connection, and joy. Number 6. Home is the true sanctuary. Mr. William, a 77-year-old man, once loved visiting friends, going out for coffee, and keeping up with social gatherings. He believed that staying active and engaged with others was the key to a fulfilling life. But over time, something started to change. One Saturday afternoon, William had plans to visit an old friend, Robert. He had been looking forward to reminiscing about old times, sharing laughter, and catching up. But as the day went on, he felt something deep inside resisting the idea of leaving home. The cozy chair by the window, where he loved to sit and read, felt too inviting to abandon. The sunlight streaming through the curtains, the gentle hum of the kettle boiling in the kitchen. Everything about his home felt peaceful, warm, and familiar. For a moment he hesitated. Should he cancel? Would it be rude? Would Robert understand? Then a simple thought crossed his mind. Why should I force myself to go when I feel happiest right here? He picked up the phone, dialed Robert, and chuckled softly. My friend, I think today is one of those days where home is calling me to stay. And just like that, he chose himself. Instead of forcing himself into a tiring social interaction, he spent the afternoon in his favorite chair, sipping tea, reading, and simply existing in the quiet comfort of his own space. He wasn't lonely. In fact, he felt more at peace than he had in a long time. That day, Mr. William realized something important. Home wasn't just a place he lived. It was where his heart truly felt at ease. He no longer needed to prove anything by constantly being out and about. He no longer felt the pressure to accept every invitation or worry about being labeled as unsocial. The truth was, he wasn't avoiding people. He was embracing himself. From then on, whenever someone invited him out, he asked himself one simple question. Will this bring me more joy than the peace of home? If the answer was no, he no longer felt guilty about saying, maybe another time. Underscore 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 key lesson. Growing older means learning to honor what truly makes you happy. For some, that means being social. But for others, it means cherishing the sanctuary of home. If home brings you peace, comfort, and joy, then why force yourself into a world that no longer fulfills you? You don't have to go anywhere to feel content. Sometimes, happiness is already right where you are. Number 7. Mr. Edward, the disrespect that changed everything for most of his life. Mr. Edward, a 79-year-old man, was a respected figure in his family. He had worked hard, raised his children with love, and always believed that family was the most important thing in life. He thought that as he aged, he would be surrounded by the warmth and appreciation of his children and grandchildren. But as the years passed, he realized that respect was something he no longer received. One evening, Edward visited his son's house for dinner. He had been looking forward to it all week, a chance to sit down with his family, share stories, and feel like he still had a place in their world. As he sat at the dinner table, he started to tell a story from his younger years, a memory about how he built his first business with nothing but determination and hard work. But before he could finish his sentence, his grandson, barely looking up from his phone, muttered, "We've heard this one before." The room went silent for a second. Then his son chuckled. "Dad, you really do tell the same stories over and over," he added casually, before shifting the conversation to something else, something that didn't include Edward at all. Edward sat there, holding his fork, feeling like an outsider in his own family. No one had even noticed that he had stopped talking. That night, as he drove home alone, a painful realization sank in. He was no longer seen as someone to be listened to, but as someone to be tolerated. His wisdom, his experiences, the very life he had lived, they no longer mattered to the people who once looked up to him. For days, the moment replayed in his mind. He wondered if he was being too sensitive, if maybe it was just a passing remark. But deep down, He knew the truth. He had spent his whole life giving to his family. Yet now, he felt invisible in their presence. Then, one evening, as he sat in his quiet living room, he made a decision. He would stop going where he wasn't valued. From that moment on, he stopped forcing himself to visit his son's house out of obligation. He no longer sat through dinners where his voice was ignored. Instead, he found companionship in old friends, in books, in people who still appreciated the lessons he had to share. And something incredible happened. He started feeling happier. He was no longer waiting for scraps of attention from those who had stopped seeing him. Instead, he focused on spending time with those who truly valued him, even if that meant choosing solitude over shallow company. Key lesson: respect should not disappear with age. If people no longer listen, if they make you feel small or irrelevant, you don't have to keep showing up for them. Instead, go where you are valued, where your stories are heard, and where your presence is appreciated. If that means choosing quiet evenings at home over being dismissed at the dinner table, then so be it. You deserve more than just a seat at the table. You deserve to be heard. Maybe it's time to choose yourself. Without guilt. For years, we were told that staying busy, maintaining relationships, and always showing up for others was the key to a meaningful life. But what happens when those expectations no longer bring joy, but only exhaustion? Through the stories of Mr. Richard, Mr. Martin, Mrs. Evelyn, Mr. Walter, Mrs. Eleanor, Mr. William, and Mr. Edward, we see a simple but powerful truth. Happiness isn't found in forcing yourself to hold onto relationships, responsibilities, or routines that no longer serve you. Maybe you felt it too. That exhaustion after a social gathering, the frustration of not being heard, the pressure to keep saying yes when your heart is screaming for rest. But what if choosing peace over obligation isn't selfish, but the very thing you need to truly enjoy life? Stepping back from unnecessary social interactions, prioritizing your mental and emotional well-being, and embracing solitude doesn't mean loneliness. It means freedom. It means making space for real connections, for personal growth, and most importantly, for yourself. Where are you from? If you agree with this perspective, share your thoughts or simply press 9. And remember, sometimes, peace isn't found in crowded places, but in the space you create to truly honor yourself.